A weathered farmhouse stands empty on a Stokes County hill, and on the kitchen table sits an uncut Christmas cake nobody ever ate. This is the true story of the Lawson family. To understand what happened at Brook Cove, you have to start with an ordinary place on an ordinary road. In the winter of 1929, the Lawsons lived in a modest farmhouse in a rural community near Germanton in Stokes County, North Carolina. This was the northwestern edge of the Piedmont tobacco country in the foothills below the Soratown Mountains, where the horizon carried the rough shapes of Hanging Rock and Pilot Mountain, and the Blue Ridge rose farther on. It was not the high mountains, but it was mountain-shadowed land, and it kept mountain ways, small farms, log tobacco barns, Baptist churches at the crossroads, and about 20 miles south sat Winston-Salem, the tobacco and textile capital of the state, the city of R.J. Reynolds, where a farmer hauled his cured leaf to the warehouses and hoped the auction went his way. Charlie Davis Lawson was 43 years old that winter. He was a tobacco farmer, a husband, and a father, and by every account that survives, he was an ordinary one. He had married Fannie Manring back in 1911. By December of 1929, the two of them had raised a houseful. 8 children had been born to them across those 18 years. One, a boy named William, had died of illness in 1920, just 6 years old. That left 7 living children under Charlie and Fannie's roof, from a grown daughter of 17 down to an infant of a few months. They farmed bright-leaf tobacco, the cash crop of the whole region. You planted it, you topped it, you primed the leaves, and you cured them in the log barns that stood on nearly every farm in the county. Then you hauled the crop to Winston-Salem and took whatever the market gave you. In 1929, the market was giving farmers less and less. The Great Depression was just beginning to close its hand over the country, and farm prices were collapsing. Whether Charlie owned his land outright or worked it on shares, the sources do not entirely agree. What is certain is that he was a working tobacco farmer at the worst possible moment to be one, with 7 children to feed. It was, in short, an unremarkable family in an unremarkable place. And that is exactly why what happened would echo for 100 years. There is one thing about the Lawsons that winter that nobody could explain then, and few can explain now. A couple of weeks before Christmas, in the middle of December, Charlie loaded the whole family into a car and drove them the 20 miles down to Winston-Salem. He took them to a photography studio, and he had a formal portrait made of all of them together. Then he bought every one of them new clothes, store-bought clothes, off the shelf, and he reportedly let the children pick out candy. Now, understand what that meant for a cash-strapped farm family in the winter of 1929. Store clothes were a luxury. A studio portrait was a luxury. Doing both at once for 9 people in the teeth of a collapsing tobacco market was the kind of spending that turned neighbors' heads. At the time, maybe it looked like a proud father treating his family for Christmas. Only later, looking back, would people read something colder into it. That is the reading that has followed the case ever since, that he knew. But that is interpretation, not fact, and it is worth being careful here. What is documented is simple and strange enough on its own. He took his family to have their picture made, and he dressed them in new clothes, and within days, almost all of them would be gone. The portrait survives. It is the last time the Lawsons were ever together and whole, and it is the image the whole story hangs on. Christmas Day, 1929, came to Brook Cove cold and quiet. Marie, the 17-year-old, the eldest daughter, had baked a cake for the family. It sat waiting. The younger children had their sweets and their new clothes. It was, for a few hours, an ordinary Christmas morning on an ordinary farm. Sometime that day, Charlie sent his 16-year-old son away. The boy's name was Arthur, and accounts differ on the exact errand. Some say he was sent to a relative's house. Some say he was sent to fetch something. What matters is that Charlie sent him off, and in doing so, removed from the farm the one person strong enough to have stood in his way. Arthur went. That single errand is the reason there is a survivor to this story at all. What happened next has to be told plainly and then set down. On Christmas Day at the family farm, Charlie Lawson killed his wife Fannie and 6 of their children with a 12-gauge shotgun. 7 members of his family died that afternoon. There is no softening the fact of it, and there is no reason to dwell on it. The record is clear, the guilt is undisputed, and the horror of this case has never lived in the details of the act. It lives in everything around it. The 6 children who died that day should be named once, together, and remembered. Marie, 17, Carrie, 12, Maybelle, 7, James, 4, Raymond, 2, and the baby, Mary Lou, only about 4 months old. Their mother, Fannie, was 37. That is the whole of the loss, and it is enough. When it was over, Charlie did not run, and he did not turn himself in. He walked out into the woods behind the farm. Investigators who came later found something in the ground there that has haunted the telling of this case ever since. In the soft earth around one tree, there were footprints circling it, as though a man had walked round and round that trunk for a long time before he could do what he did next. What he was thinking in those minutes, no one will ever know. Hours after the killings, in those woods, Charlie Lawson took his own life. He was the 8th and last to die, and here the case turns from a crime into something else, because there was no killer left to hunt. There would be no trial, no manhunt across the mountains, no grand jury, no district attorney, no jury deliberating into the night. The man who did it was dead by his own hand before the sun went down. Everything that a case like this normally sets in motion simply stopped before it began. What was left was not a question of who, and not even a question of what. It was a single question, the only one that mattered, and the one nobody could answer. Why? Word spread the way bad news spread in a rural county in 1929, from farm to farm, mouth to mouth. Neighbors came, Lawson kin came. Someone summoned the Stokes County sheriff, and the machinery of a thinly staffed rural law began to turn, though there was almost nothing for it to do. This was not a mystery to be solved with evidence. A coroner's inquest was convened in those final days of December. Death records were filed with the county. The inquest established what everyone already knew, that Charlie Lawson had killed his family and then himself, that the deaths were murder and suicide. There was no one to charge, no one to accuse, no verdict to hand down. The lawmen who came to that farm were not there to build a case. They were there to count the dead and to write it down. But there was one investigation of a kind, and it was not a criminal one. It was medical. Because from the very first hours, the family and the community reached for the only explanation that offered any mercy at all: the idea that something must have been physically wrong with Charlie, something in his body or his mind that could account for the unaccountable. And there was a thread to pull. Some years before, though exactly when and exactly how the record does not firmly say, Charlie had suffered a head injury. Family members would later say he was changed after it, quieter or darker, or simply not himself. It was thin, but it was something. And in the days after Christmas, it would send Charlie Lawson's story somewhere no one on that farm could have imagined. In the days after Christmas, Charlie Lawson's brain was removed and sent away to be examined. The reports say it went to Johns Hopkins, one of the finest medical institutions in the country, carried far from that Stokes County farm in search of an answer. The hope, spoken and unspoken, was that the doctors would find something. A mass, a malformation, some ruined place in the tissue that could be pointed to and named so that the family could say it was the injury, it was the illness, it was not simply a man choosing to do this. If there was a physical cause, then there was a kind of mercy in it. The examination found no clear abnormality, no obvious explanation. Whatever the doctors looked for, they did not find it, and they could not say that anything in Charlie Lawson's brain had made him do what he did. Over the years, the story would grow a firmer shape than the record supports. People would say there had been a tumor, that the tumor explained everything. But that is a later embellishment, not what the primary record shows. The truth is thinner and harder. His brain was examined, and it yielded no answer. The one door that might have given the family peace was opened, and behind it there was nothing. On December 27th, 2 days after the killings, the Lawsons were buried. The funeral was held at Browder Baptist Church, the community's own church and burial ground, the place where these families christened their babies and married their young and laid their old people down. Nothing in that church's history had prepared it for this. Fannie and her 6 children were buried together, and the graveside became the center of something the county had never seen. They came by the thousands. Contemporary accounts put the crowd at roughly 5,000 people beyond the local mourners, strangers drawn from across the region to a single farm burial. Cars lined the roads for 3 miles, nose to tail, in a county where many families still traveled by horse and wagon. Picture that: a rural Baptist churchyard in the foothills, and a river of automobiles stretching back 3 miles down the dirt roads, and 5,000 strangers standing in the December cold to watch a mother and her children go into the ground. Grief on that scale is not really grief anymore. It is something closer to awe, the whole region straining to look at a thing it could not comprehend. And that straining to look did not end at the graveside. This is where the story becomes something almost unbelievable, and yet every part of it is documented. Within about 10 days of the murders, Charlie's brother, Marion Lawson, opened the farmhouse to the public, not as a memorial, as an attraction. For 25 cents, a person could walk through the house where the family had died and see it left as it was. The belongings in their places, the children's things, and on the table, Marie's Christmas cake, the one the 17-year-old had baked before that Christmas day, sitting uncut and uneaten where it had been left. People came in numbers that beggar belief. At its peak, the reports describe as many as 500 visitors in a single day, paying their quarters to file through the rooms. Over the weeks and months that followed, The totals climbed into figures that later retellings would stretch into the tens of thousands, though the firm single-source counts are the 500 a day and the 5,000 at the funeral. Whatever the exact number, the phenomenon is beyond dispute. A family had been destroyed on Christmas morning, and within a fortnight the place of their deaths had become a roadside spectacle in the middle of the Great Depression, a paid attraction for the curious and the grieving and the merely bored. And the detail that says the most, the one that fixes the whole grim carnival in a single image, is the cake. Souvenir hunters, wanting something to carry away from the house, began picking the raisins out of Marie's cake, one by one, until someone finally set it under a covered glass cake server to protect what was left. That is where the case sits at its strangest. A girl bakes a cake for her family's Christmas. Days later, strangers are prying the raisins from it for keepsakes, and a dome of glass is placed over the ruin to preserve it for the paying crowds. If stories like this one from the mountains matter to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it helps keep cases like the Lawsons from slipping out of memory altogether. Arthur did not vanish into the story. He went on. He grew up. He married. He had children of his own, and he carried the name forward into a generation that never knew the farm at Brook Cove as anything but a sorrow. His survival is not an irony, and it should not be told as one. It is the one thread of ordinary human continuation that the case allows, the proof that something of the Lawsons lived on past that Christmas. In 1945, some 16 years after the murders, Arthur died in a vehicle accident near Walnut Cove. He was about 31 years old. He had lived roughly as long after that Christmas as he had lived before it, and in those years he had built the very thing his father had destroyed, a family. That is where the survivor's story rests. There is one more thing worth settling before the reckoning, and it concerns Arthur's age, because it tells you something about how a case like this hardens into legend. The record disagrees with itself. The North Carolina State Archive and the plain arithmetic of a boy born in 1913 who died in 1945 put Arthur at 16 on the day of the murders. Other tellings, including some widely read ones, say he was 19. The likelier figure is 16, but the disagreement is the point. Even the simplest fact about this family, the age of the boy who lived, comes down to us doubled and uncertain, because the story was retold so many times by so many hands that the edges blurred. And retold it was, because the mountains do not forget a thing like this. They set it to music. In March of 1930, only weeks after the burials, a singer named Walter Smith, known as Kid Smith, went into a studio with a string band called the Carolina Buddies, a group tied to the fiddler Posey Rohrer, and recorded a song for Columbia Records. It was called The Murder of the Lawson Family. It laid out the story in verse, the way the old ballads had always carried the news and the grief of the mountains from one holler to the next, long before anyone had a radio to hear it on. That song did what songs do. It traveled. It outlasted the newspaper front pages and the crowds at the farmhouse door. Over the decades, other musicians took it up, among them the Stanley Brothers, who recorded their own version in 1956, carrying the Lawsons' name to audiences who had never heard of Stokes County. The ballad became the vessel. When the farmhouse was gone and the crowds had scattered and the quarters stopped changing hands, the song remained, and through it the family stayed known. This is how the mountains remember their dead. Not in courthouses, because there was no trial. Not in verdicts, because there was no verdict. But in a set of verses a man could sing, passing the story down the years intact. And so the case comes back, as it always must, to the one question the music could not answer any more than the doctors could. Why? Why would a 43-year-old tobacco farmer on Christmas Day, in a house full of new clothes and sweets and a fresh-baked cake, do this to the people he had spent 18 years providing for? That question has been turned over for nearly a century now, and it has produced not one answer, but several, each of them plausible, none of them proven, all of them competing for a place in a silence that has never been filled. The first thread is the head injury. Some years before that Christmas, Charlie had been hurt, struck on the head in a manner the record never firmly pins down. Those close to him would say afterward that he was not the same man once he had healed. Something in his temperament had shifted. This is the explanation the family reached for first, and it is the one that sent his brain across several states to the doctors. But the examination, as we know, came back without a finding, and so the head injury remains exactly what it was, a reported change in a man that no physician could ever tie to what he did. It explains and it does not explain. It is a door that opens onto another door. The second thread is money, and the season, and the crushing arithmetic of a tobacco farm in the winter of 1929. The Depression was settling over the country. Crop prices were falling, a man with 7 children to feed, and a collapsing market for the only thing he knew how to grow was a man under a weight that is easy to name and hard to measure. Debt and dread have driven people to terrible ends before and since. But plenty of farmers in Stokes County faced the same failing prices that winter, the same thin larders, the same bad auctions in Winston-Salem, and they did not do what Charlie Lawson did. Hard times are a pressure, not an explanation. They tell you the weather he was standing in. They do not tell you why he alone was struck. The third thread is the one the record handles most carefully, and so must we. Decades after the murders, researchers and some relatives came forward with the idea that there had been a family secret, something hidden inside that household, and that it may have been the trigger for everything that followed. The chief chronicler of the case, the author Trudy Smith, gathered this account in her books on the family, drawing on second-hand testimony passed down within the community. It is a theory, and it is a contested one, and it has never been proven. It concerns matters that are private and painful, and so it is right to say only this much and no more. Some who studied the case came to believe a family secret lay beneath the killings. Others do not accept it. The evidence is thin, second-hand, and old. It is offered here as what it is, a proposed explanation credited to named researchers, unproven and unprovable at this distance, and nothing about its nature will be paraded for effect. To do so would be to repeat the very sin of that farmhouse door, turning a family's deepest pain into a spectacle for the curious. And there, really, is where the theories run out. A head injury with no medical proof behind it. A financial pressure shared by thousands who did no such thing. A contested secret that cannot be confirmed. Line them up together, and you will notice something about them. Not one closes the case. Not one turns the key all the way. You can believe any of them, or all of them at once, or none, and you will still be left standing in the same cold spot the coroner stood in at the end of December 1929, looking at a farm full of the dead and unable to say the single word that would make it make sense. That is the hardest truth this case has to offer, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Most stories of this kind eventually surrender an explanation. A jury hears the evidence and renders a verdict. A confession is written down. A motive is established in a courtroom and entered into the record, and whether or not it satisfies, it exists, a thing you can point to. The Lawson case gives you none of that. There was no trial to force the facts into the open, no cross-examination, no closing argument, no 12 people filing back in with a finding. There was only a man who walked into the woods and took the answer with him, leaving behind footprints circling a tree and a question with no floor. The people of Stokes County were left to build what meaning they could out of what they had. They had the graves at Browder Baptist. They had the photograph from the Winston-Salem studio, that last portrait of a whole family in their new clothes, staring out of the frame at a future not one of the children in it would reach. They had the ballad, carrying the story down the generations in verse. And, for a while, to their lasting discomfort, they had the farmhouse and its quarter admission and its cake under glass until the appetite for that faded and the house was left to the years. What they did not have, and what no one has had since, is the why. Nearly 100 years of retelling, 2 published books of careful research, a state archive entry, newspaper morgues full of 1929 headlines, and still the center of the case is empty. Every generation that comes to it brings its own guess. The head injury, the failing farm, the hidden secret, and every generation sets its guess down in the same place, against the same silence, and walks away no more certain than the mourners who stood 3 miles deep in the December cold. There is a particular kind of horror in that emptiness, quieter than the crime itself, but longer lasting. It is the horror of a thing that will not resolve. A locked door with no key on either side of it. The Lawsons did not die in a mystery of who or how. Everyone knew who from the first hour, and the how was written plainly in the coroner's book. They died inside a mystery of why, and that mystery has proven more durable than the farmhouse, more durable than the crowds, more durable than the very stones over their graves, which the weather is slowly wearing smooth. Today, the farmhouse is long gone, and the crowds and their quarters are a memory that embarrasses more than it draws. What remains is quieter. The Lawson family rests together at Browder Baptist Church Cemetery in Stokes County, North Carolina, under a shared marker that carries their names and their dates, a mother and her children side by side in the foothills below the Sorrowtown Range. The weather works at the stone a little more each year, and somewhere, held in an archive and a book and the memory of a community, that studio portrait still looks back out at us, a whole family in their new Christmas clothes, the uncut cake still waiting on a table nobody sat down to. What happened there was never explained, and perhaps now it never will be. But the Lawsons are remembered, and in the end, against a silence that swallowed everything else, that is the one thing left to hold on to.